Matt Bradley, thank you. And joining me now, former Supreme Allied Commander at NATO, retired four-star Navy Admiral James Stavridis. Admiral, if a deal is reached, it would bring an end to nearly 9 months of fighting in Gaza. But as Matt said there, we've been here before. So what's different this time around?
Biggest thing, in my view, is on the Israeli side. They are growing increasingly concerned, Ali, about the north, about Hezbollah. Hundreds of rockets coming in. They are actively preparing for some level of military activity to the north. Therefore, they want the flexibility to be able to move troops, large numbers, out of Gaza and have them up in the north. That's on the Israeli side. On the Hamas side, they are running out of resources and support from the Arab world. More and more pressure on them from the Qataris, principally, also the Egyptians. So both sides don't trust each other, don't really want to do a deal, but are hitting the point where they are being pressured into it by outside factors, Ali.
You really beautifully lay out the contours on each side here. But as we see Israeli officials trying to lower expectations, is there anything to the timing of their announcement? Why now?
I think the Israelis are very mindful of the American political season that's unfolding in front of our eyes. So that's another big factor here. And let's be candid, the Biden administration desperately wants to avoid an escalation in this conflict and love to put a ceasefire on the board. I think the Israelis are cognizant of this. And of course, currently scheduled, Benjamin Netanyahu coming to address the U.S. Congress. All of those factors are at play here, and I think are putting additional pressure on the Israeli side to try and get to a point of ceasefire. Boy, let's hope so.
Well, because you talk about the fear that this could only become a further escalated conflict in a more broad way within the region. There's long been a concern about an escalation with Hezbollah in the region. What's your level of concern about that at this point?
It's pretty high, but not off the charts. Let me explain. Hezbollah is not going to turn this into a wider war without Iranian concurrence. Hezbollah, like Hamas, is a creature of Tehran. And Ali, as you well know, the Iranians are in the midst of their political season. They're trying to settle a new leader for the country. The supreme leader is very focused internally. Iran simply doesn't want a wider war at this point. I think for that reason, it's quite unlikely we're going to see things broaden to the north. So to conclude, in kind of a perfect world here, we'll see a ceasefire in the south in Gaza. Hezbollah will be restrained by Iran. We may get to a point of stability here as the summer unfolds and we get into the fall.
And then, of course, for the families whose loved ones are still being held by Hamas, these 9 months have been agonizing. How essential is it to get this deal done correctly? And what do you think is happening behind the scenes right now?
This is an entire adjacent stream of effort that in many ways, from a humanitarian perspective, is the most important one, certainly for those families. And that work has been unceasingly followed by the Biden administration on behalf of the Americans who are in that group. And of course, a great deal of internal pressure from those Israeli families who have hostages being held in Gaza. So that stream is bound up in this idea of a ceasefire. I think if it all lands, and I'd give it a 50-50 chance at this point, which is higher than it's been in quite some time, if it all lands, we might see those hostages coming home over the next few weeks. I'm knocking on wood as I'm saying that, Ali.
And we've talked about the ways that the Biden administration is probably doing the same thing. As a senior administration official tells us here at NBC that President Biden's expected to discuss the latest progress on a deal with the U.S.'s European partners at a NATO summit that's in Washington next week. So as we look ahead to that, what should we expect to come out of next week's summit, and what would be a good sign to you?
Well, in terms of overall focus of the NATO summit, job one from a NATO perspective is, of course, going to be the war in Ukraine. And I think you'll see continuing strong support from all of the NATO nations represented in Washington at the summit level. These will be the heads of each of the 32 nations in the alliance. So that'll be focus number one, Ukraine. But certainly running alongside that is broad concern for the alliance and for particularly our European colleagues who are so close to these events in the Middle East. What can NATO do to tamp down the potential of that wider war that we discussed a moment ago? I think a good sign coming out would be NATO in unison in the final communique talking about the need to resolve diplomatically what's happening in Gaza and avoid a wider war. Look for that by the end of the summit next week.
We all will be. Admiral James Stavridis, thank you for joining us.